Okay, so hello, everybody. This is a review session for Unit 6. My kind of intention with this is to answer any questions about chapters 20, 21, or 22. Just a reminder, if you were not able to attend yesterday's session, that we did go over the rest of chapter 22. So there is a video of me talking about chapter 22. There's a video of Mr. Keel talking about chapter 22. That's on the post that goes with the PowerPoint for that chapter. And then also you can always read the textbook, get the information from there. So without further ado, you should be able to see my screen. This is the same document I was working on yesterday. I'm just gonna, if I'm gonna write things down, I'll just add it to this document. Can someone reply in the chat? Can you see the sharing? Does everything look okay on your side? Okay, perfect. So we have 3 chapters to talk about. 8A students will be taking the test tomorrow. Remember, we are offering a review session tomorrow morning, starting at 7:50 in my classroom. There's also a review session on Monday morning for B-Day students. Okay, so I thought we could kind of start off with chapter 20 and talk about imperialism for a little bit. Does that sound okay with everybody? Okay. So remember, chapter 20 is all about imperialism. So imperialism is when a stronger nation takes over a weaker nation. And we saw some reasons why that happens. Some of the biggest ones is economic reason, so that we can trade, we can take over new resources. Then we can also use it as like a place that we can go and trade with other nations with. Here's an example of that. Remember, some Americans who wanted to expand the United States wanted the Philippines. And a big reason for wanting that is because it's basically a stepping stone to trade with China. Okay, because the Philippines is so close to China and the rest of Asia, this is going to allow the United States to trade with them. So that's an example of how economics can lead to imperialism, lead to the desire for that. We also saw this in Hawaii. Remember, in Hawaii, that's where we had the American planters wanting more trade. And so they're going to help take over Hawaii. Remember, Hawaii was a kingdom. We had Queen Liliuokalani. The United States took that over. Okay. And again, if I'm talking too fast or you have a question about what I'm talking about, please make sure you put it in the chat, or I think you can unmute yourself. Specifically with economics, we also have what's happening in China. Remember, we created the open door notes that said multiple countries and trade in China and not take it over completely. So all these countries agreed to trade in China. They all kind of separated from each other, so that way no country is kicked out. It's just them. That's called the open door notes. That's an agreement amongst mostly European countries. The kind of exceptions for that are the United States and Japan also were a part of this, all trading with China. Okay. We also talked about Teddy Roosevelt's policies. So a couple of his policies with imperialism is his big stick policy. So this is the using the U.S. Navy in the Caribbean to make countries do what we want them to do. Okay, this is going to be made easier after the Panama Canal is built, right? Because the Panama Canal is built, now we have more Navy ships going through this area, and we basically use that as a way to say, hey, Caribbean nations or Central American nations, do what we want, otherwise we'll attack you. Okay. Let me see. I'm looking at my work over here too, the test that we're going to be taking and everything. So if I'm going back and forth, that's why. Yeah, I think that's about it. Any questions about imperialism? Those are some of the big things, the big ideas that we talked about in class. Any questions about that? Some other words that we might see for imperialism. Sometimes we see people being called expansionists, okay, because they want to expand the United States. Sometimes we might refer to them as interventionists, okay, because if a country is doing something we don't want, we will intervene. We see this in all the countries that I listed below. Okay. One of the questions is, someone texted, is political reasons. And political reasons for imperialism were all about spreading democracy. Okay. Yeah, so that's what that is. America has the best government, so let's spread that. Another question, is there a difference between imperialism and expansionism? No, expansionism just means that we're growing, and imperialism is the way you do that. So, because you could use expansionism when we were talking back in the 1830s and 40s when people wanted to spread west. Imperialism, we pretty much only use, historians only use it when describing like taking over islands around the world. Okay. Okay, let's talk about World War One. So, first we got to talk about why the U.S. joins, and there's two big reasons why they join. There is, here, I'll write it down here. The Zimmerman Note, which remember is Germany's proposed alliance with Mexico. And the other is unrestricted submarine warfare. So German submarines are blowing up U.S. ships. Okay, those are the two major reasons. Yeah, sorry, Meredith, I'll slow down a little bit. Those are the two primary reasons why the U.S. will join World War One. Zimmerman Note is from Germany. Remember, Mexico is kind of going through this political instability, where we had Pancho Villa. He's in your study guide. He attacked some Americans, so we're already worried about Mexico. And if Germany is saying, hey, Mexico, you should join us in this fight, And if we win, you can get some land back from the United States. This is going to make Americans really mad. But the big thing that turns President Wilson to supporting the war effort is unrestricted submarine warfare. Just day after day after day, Germany keeps blowing up American ships, even after they promise not to anymore. Remember when he ran for president in 1916, Woodrow Wilson ran on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." And so that showed Americans were not wanting to go to war, but in Wilson's war message, he asks to get involved to make the world safe for democracy. Okay, so that kind of goes back to what we were saying before with political reasons, right? Spreading democracy, and if things threaten democracy, we're willing to intervene, to get involved. And here shows America's interventionism, that we are willing to get involved, in this case, for economic and political reasons. The biggest thing is economic, because our ships are getting blown up, but political because of the Zimmerman note and this idea that the autocracy of Germany during this time could take down democracy in Europe. Okay. And so the US has to figure out how to get ready for the war. Remember, even though the war's been going on for about 2.5 years now, America is not ready to fight. And so they have to what's called mobilize for war. They have to get their economy ready, get their people ready to fight. One of the ways they're going to do that is through the War Industries Board. Okay, War Industries Board is all about ordering factories to make war supplies. So all these factories are making stuff for normal people, for peacetime, and we have to convert these factories to make the war supplies that are necessary for the war. And so this group is going to come in and tell businesses, we want you to make this, we want you to make that, we'll make sure you get the supplies you need. So this is a really large growth of the economy, or growth of the government. Government had never really done something like this before. So this shows that they're growing in their power compared to something they really haven't ever done before. Okay. And with all these factories that are making war supplies, there is a high demand for labor. And many of these factories that are built in New England and in the Midwest. And so they're needing more labor. And many factories during this time find more workers in the Great Migration, which is when thousands of African American people moved to northern cities to work in war factories. Okay. And so with the help of African American workers, with women who are working, many of these factories are able to produce enough stuff, not just for our army, but also for our allies, and really helps us to ultimately close out the war. Okay. Remember, not everybody supported the war, though. In fact, some people were against the war and tried to protest. There was the Sedition Act, which made it illegal to for anti-war speech. One man who did this, I'm forgetting his first name now, but his last name was Schenck. He gets arrested for speaking out against the war and speaking out against the draft specifically. And he will actually sue based on the idea that the government is taking away his freedom of speech. And it goes all the way to the Supreme Court in Schenck versus United States. And in this case, Schenck, or the Supreme Court, says the government can restrict speech during wartime. Okay. And so this speech in it, or this decision itself, goes against the First Amendment, the Bill of Rights. The First Amendment provides different rights, including the freedom of speech. One could argue, and Schenck did argue, that this violated his First Amendment rights. And I will say one more thing about Sedition Act. Who is most likely to be targeted for the Sedition Act? Many radicals who are against U.S. foreign policy are mostly the ones who are speaking out against the war or speaking out against the government's involvement. And that's who would usually be targeted in these situations. So the war is drawing to a close. And President Wilson comes up with his plan for the end of the war. It's called the 14 points. And the 14 points were 14 ideas he had to end the war. The most important part of it is, let's say, Wilson's plans for peace. It included the peace organization called the League of Nations. A League of Nations is supposed to be where all the countries gather together, talk about peace, avoid war in the future. This is the only idea from the 14 points that's actually agreed upon by the European nations. They get rid of all the other 13 ideas. They keep just the League of Nations. But remember, there's a lot of disagreement back in the United States about the League of Nations. And it leads to lots of debates in the Senate over should we allow this treaty or not. One of the biggest problems they have with the League of Nations is that it, in Article 10, the US would have to join a war if another country is attacked. So if another country is attacked, we are bound by this agreement in the League of Nations that we would have to join too. And so some in the Senate are afraid this could make the US more likely to be brought into a future war. And so Americans want to have the ability to say yes or no, we do want to go to war. And so ultimately, the Treaty of Versailles is not agreed upon. And the United States never does join the League of Nations. Okay, any questions? Okay. Next, I'm going to talk about chapter 21. I think I'm just going to do chapter 21 and then I'll call it for this session. I can review more of 22 tomorrow during my review session, answer any questions people might have. We'll go to chapter 21 now. Okay, since we're talking about our foreign policy with World War I, let's talk about their foreign policy in the 1920s. After the war, America is kind of sick of being involved um, uh, with the wartime. We're sick of getting involved with the war, and so America wants to expand our American businesses around the world, and especially in Central America. Remember we talked in class about like trading with other countries and getting things like the banana, and that being a big deal for Americans and getting new resources and new products. Okay. Economic policy in the 1920s. The government wants businesses to grow, and so they take away regulations or rules for businesses. And so with that, the economy does grow. We see this happening with presidents like President Calvin Coolidge, President Harding. They want these businesses to grow. They want specifically American businesses to grow. So that's why they're trying to go around the world. That's why they're getting rid of regulations and rules. We see other government policies like lowering the taxes on richest Americans. Hold on one second, everybody. Okay, so while businesses are growing in the 1920s, one thing that's not growing is wages of workers. And so we see a growing divide between richest Americans and working class Americans, where rich are getting richer and the poor are staying poor. Okay. And for people who are struggling, it's very difficult to keep up, even though the standard of living is increasing. And what that means is that there's all these new products that are coming out, and there's kind of this societal expectation that, oh, you should have a radio in your house. Everybody has it. And this kind of expectation of like everyone should have like this or something like that. And so for people who felt like they needed these products but couldn't afford it at the time, they would do something that was relatively new at this time, was buying on credit. So borrowing money and paying later. And so that's going to really hurt. In the 1920s, it's going to cause a greater divide, especially when we see people who are going to borrow money to buy stocks. Okay. So it's kind of economic situation that's going on in the 1920s. For social changes, we've talked about a few different groups, like women of the 1920s were flappers. Women who feel more independent, more willing to go out and have fun, go to nightclubs, wear shorter dresses, cut their hair shorter. They become very popular in big cities and in movies. We don't see the necessarily flappers in like small towns as much. There's kind of more of a communal pressure against that in small towns. Okay. For African Americans, one of the biggest changes in the 1920s is called the Harlem Renaissance. And the Harlem Renaissance was the appreciation of Black participation and leadership in economics, arts, and society. Okay. It was we see authors, poets, sculptors, painters, musicians who are Black. And in Harlem, New York at this time, there's this exposure of Black contributions in the United States that really wasn't think gained as much national attention before this time period. For example, in Harlem, New York, they would have jazz clubs where Black performers would play jazz music, and it was something that would get wide followings from people around the country, and that had not really happened before. Okay. In the 1920s, we also see immigration restrictions. I'll give a second if I didn't give enough time to write down the Harlem Renaissance. So remember, there is this fear after World War I that immigrants are bringing radical ideas. And so the government will create quotas. to limit immigration from Eastern Europe. So, who would support these? Nativists support the restrictions. Many labor unions supported restrictions because they didn't want more workers coming in to compete for jobs. People who are moving to big cities during this time to find jobs. So if you're moving from like a small town, if you're moving through the Great Migration, African American workers supported restrictions because that's more competition for jobs in factories. One group of people who might be opposed to restrictions obviously are the immigrants themselves, but also business executives. So these are business owners, because business owners want as many people coming over as possible, because more competition means you don't have to raise wages for your workers. If someone complains or gets in trouble at your job, you just fire them and you hire any one of the other immigrants who are all looking for jobs. So remember, these new immigrants are coming over. This is the largest group of immigrants coming in during this time. So these are new immigrants. Some of the biggest countries they're coming from are places like Italy, Poland. Those are some of the biggest sources of immigration in the 1920s. A lot of the immigration restrictions are coming from the Red Scare, where Americans are afraid of communists and radicals. Remember, right after World War I, we had quite a few labor unions go on strike, and so many associated labor unions. Here, let's say this. Many associated labor unions with radicalism. Okay, so they're afraid, oh, if you are going on strike, then you must be a radical. And so this led to labor unions decreasing in their membership. And it also made people fear that a communist revolution could be taking place in the United States. I mentioned Calvin Coolidge a little bit before. Remember, he is a pro-business president. He is against progressive efforts to reform the economy. Remember, reform means you're changing something. He doesn't want those changes. He wants to go back to the way it was before, when the government stayed out of businesses and didn't make rules for them. So he's against the progressive changes. And in the 1920s, the Progressive Party really falls apart. We don't see very many progressive movements in the 1920s. So people who really liked Coolidge were business executives again. Okay, those are some of the big things from chapter 21. It's kind of the big things I wanted to mention. Are there any questions people had about chapter 21 that we haven't talked about? Okay, I'm not seeing anything over the chat. Oh, is there anything about automobiles on the test? I don't think there's going to be. All you need to know is people like buying and driving cars. That's it. Okay. So on Friday, tomorrow morning, I'll have another review session starting at 7:50 in my room. You should be able to get in, no problem. I'll make sure the door by our den's bathroom is open, so you can come in that way. You will have to like buzz in and tell them you're here for a APUSH review session. But other than that, make sure you are checking out any of the material that we did not go over in class. All the material that we didn't go over in class is still recorded. I've made lectures and review sessions about that. They're all posted either on the stream for Google Classroom or on the post itself with the PowerPoint you're looking for. So if you have any questions, feel free to email, but we'll kind of finish up now for there, everyone. If you have any questions, feel free to let me know. Okay, that's it. Thanks, everybody.